So welcome everyone to today's Philosophy Matters talk. I'm Les Allen, the facilitator, and our special guest tonight is Joe Bullock. And the title of tonight's talk is 21st Century Stoicism, Stoic Cosmopolitanism. So a little about what the talk is going to be about tonight. Joe Bullock will help us explore how Stoic philosophy can guide us toward a more compassionate and interconnected world. In this session, we'll be focusing on Stoic cosmopolitanism and the concept of Stoic role ethics to explore how ancient wisdom addresses modern challenges. Joe will also cover how our individual actions relate to the collective good and discuss the historical roots of cosmopolitanism and where it may be headed in the future. So a little about our speaker tonight, Joe. Joe Bullock is a co-founder of the Philadelphia Stoa, a community that is dedicated to helping individuals live happier and more meaningful lives. Joe obtained a degree in economics from Temple University and has consulted for Fortune 500 companies and various government agencies. Joe currently works for the Department of Defense and resides in Haddonfield, New Jersey. So please welcome Joe, and it's over to you, Joe.
Thanks, Les. Good evening or good morning, wherever you're dialing in from. And I appreciate everybody joining me here this morning. Just really quickly, a little bit about my journey to Stoicism. I had come to Stoicism about 5 years ago, a little over 5 years ago, actually, at this point. And I was really kind of searching for something to help bring meaning to my life. And it's been an incredible journey for me personally. Really resonated with me. It provided me with a lot of practical tools in order to live a life where my relationships have been much more fulfilling, and I'm finding a lot more meaning in my everyday engagements. So I'm really excited actually to share this, some of the ideas around Stoicism with you. So again, welcome everybody. Tonight we'll be talking about Stoic Cosmopolitanism. So I'll just go through a brief introduction as to what Stoicism is, for those of you who are just learning about what it is and how it can be used in your life. And then we'll talk about what is cosmopolitanism and why it's important. And then we'll come in and then we'll talk a little bit about our individual ethics and how that relates to what the ideal state is. And then lastly, we'll get into some of the ideas around capacity building and capabilities development, which I'm really excited. And I know this deviates a little bit from initially what I'd planned to speak about. Cosmopolitan's a very, very wide-ranging topic that has a lot, a lot of different areas where we could go into. But anyway, I think we'll go over some of the basics and try and make it practical. So really quickly, what is Stoicism? So Stoicism is based on two things. The first is living in accordance with nature. And so what does that actually mean? It means that we are actually pro-social and that we're able to reason. So the idea of being pro-social means that we work better collectively than we do as individuals. If you think about it in terms of how we work in communities, the homes we live in or whatever it may be, the cars we drive, it's part of a collective effort that enables us to do what we need to do, is playing a role in society. So the idea is that we're actually engaging with one another, but there's also this idea, as well as we understand that we do have a role in society. And this is an important idea because if you think about the opposite of it, in the sense that when we feel like we don't have a role, we feel disconnected. And if we feel disconnected, we feel isolated, and that actually can cause a lot of harm. It can cause us to feel lonely, and so it's directly related to our well-being on how we interact with one another. The second thing, again, is the idea of rationality. So the ability to reason, and this is going to be an important topic for this evening. So what does it mean to be able to reason? It's to be able to make wise decisions in the circumstances and how we respond to whatever situation we may be in. Specifically, this means maintaining our emotional balance in certain circumstances where we may have an emotional reaction, but we're able to pause, step back, and think about our response. And our response is essentially a better response than if we just responded emotionally. So and the classic example is if you get cut off in traffic, you get upset, instead of just responding, that you're able to take a step back and understand that that's what someone else did. Your reaction is what you control, and there's no sense of actually being upset. Another example would be somebody says something to you that may not be exactly kind, and you may have an emotional reaction to that. But instead of just reacting, you pause and you're able to have a response that de-escalates the situation, or is that you're reacting in an appropriate way. So this is how it enables our relationships with one another. Now, the idea of virtue is the virtue and what is up to us and what is not up to us. Those are the two other areas that are fundamental to Stoicism, in the sense that virtue is considered the only good. And why is that? Because, well, it's something that can never be used for negative. It's something that you always want to be pursuing. So the idea that you want to act wisely in a particular circumstance, or be fair with someone, another example with justice, you don't want to be unfair with someone. So you don't want to act unwisely. So it's something that is actually a good in and of itself. And what that is different than some of these other things that we may turn to be good, so to speak. So if you think about monetary wealth or things like that, some people may deem that to be good. Well, I mean, Stoics are indifferent to it in the sense that they see it as something that can actually be used for good or for bad. But in and of itself, it's not good. So same thing, the idea of technology. Technology in and of itself, though there's, I understand there's some disagreements about this. The idea that it's neutral, maybe, is up for debate. But it's how we use the technology is really the important part, not necessarily the technology itself. What is up to us and what is not up to us is another area that's really important, as far as that's fundamental, because it's what we control is how we respond. The outcomes are something that we obviously don't control, and the ability to accept the outcome, take a step back and not necessarily allow ourselves to worry about things that are outside of our control, is essential for our own personal tranquility. So there could be an example. You're going for a job. If you go for the job that you're being interviewed, and you do the interview, you do the best you can, you don't control the decision that someone else is making, but you do control how you prepared and what you did in order to put yourself in the best position to get that job. But if you don't get the job, that you're not totally dejected by the decision itself. So that means we're not tied to the outcomes. So those are these are four areas that are fundamental if you're going to actually understand the basics of Stoicism. Now, so then what is cosmopolitanism? And this is an important part for this evening, obviously, because that's the main topic. But understanding this distinction of what is universal citizenship, and what does it mean to be a citizen of the world? Universal citizenship is something where, regardless of your belief system, that you have inherent worth. And so this actually helps us transcend any kind of artificial barriers that we put up. So the idea that that there is this concept of a nation, there's this concept of a state, that there's this concept of a city. It's understanding that those things are constructed by human beings, and so that when we see that and we understand that those boundaries are essentially artificial, then we can start to recognize that there's an inherent worth in each individual. So that part of this is essential as far as our understanding as to what it means to have a universal citizenship. It also kind of extends this idea of our moral concern to include everybody in the entire planet. And one of the individuals I think that demonstrates cosmopolitanism as well as anybody is obvious is Peter Singer. He extends the moral circle not only to include human beings, but also all sentient beings. And there are Stoics that actually consider, again, the whole planet itself, the ecosystem that we're a part of, to be part of our moral concern. And this is really important because it's the idea that a sentient being can suffer, and that that we're okay with that, has an impact on us, whether we know it or not. Because essentially, if we're okay with something that feels pain, suffering, then we're okay with maybe, somebody else. We're drawing an artificial boundary there. We'll draw other artificial boundaries. Boundaries that could be based on race or belief systems. So how we treat animals is ultimately a reflection of how we treat each other. So that's an important concept to really gather and understand, because it's I would say a higher level of consciousness and awareness that we're actually considering anything that feels pain. And so it fits in with the idea of reduction of suffering. But it fits very much in with this idea of cosmopolitanism in the sense that it transcends the cultural barriers, the artificial barriers that we draw. And so that's universal citizenship in a nutshell. Now, the idea of being a citizen of the world, I would say it means that there has to be a personal responsibility that we have in order to understand diverse cultures, as well as um, uh, you know, knowing ourselves. So there's this educational component where we understand ourselves, we understand other cultures, but we also understand our roles in the community. And so this is our personal responsibility that we have and our moral obligations that have come along with the roles that we're in. So we'll hear tonight is this idea of that I'm a citizen of the world, so meaning that what are my moral obligations to essentially everyone, uh, both locally and globally. So this also one of the more important things I think that a citizen of the world is considered needs to consider is having meaningful dialogue. And this is where some of these discussion groups that, well, one that Les is here holding this evening, or even the ones that we hold locally, are very important. Because as dialogue continues, we start to have a better understanding of other people, their background, their experiences, as well as ourselves. So this is where a lifelong learning starts to become a very important component when we're talking about cosmopolitanism in general. Okay. So here's this other aspect, and I talked a little bit about this already, as to why cosmopolitanism is important to begin with. This is part of it is because we have this tendency to draw these artificial boundaries, and that what this does is this undermines social cohesion. We start to create this boundary that has us othering people, and making judgments, unjust judgments in many cases, about the individuals themselves. And there's really no rational reason as to do that. And what that does is that kind of has a way of kind of deteriorating the relationships that we have. And when you're broken up into groups, I would even argue that it's even harder in the sense. I mean, it's much more likely, I would say, that you can be divided against each other. So that instead of seeing the commonalities between the two groups and you and the other individual, you automatically start to see the differences. So Cosmopolitan also addresses the global inequality of resources. So there's an increasing disparity in resources, and with that comes the perception that there's an injustice in the world. And so that this idea that there's this injustice then creates an environment where we can be divided. So it starts to look at, okay, I'm not just looking at my personal experience. I'm taking it into consideration, but I'm also considering the fact that other people are suffering. So that gets back into the reduction of suffering. Cosmopolitanism also, I feel it really addresses the global warming crisis, that we're in extreme weather. It's very difficult, maybe sometimes, if we only have your own national initiative interests in mind, to not necessarily worry about the environment itself. So you could be contributing to accelerating many of the extreme weathers and some of the difficulties that other people are experiencing. But it's very hard to address if you're just a nation. So the idea that you can actually come together with groups like the United Nations and address things like the global warming crisis is a part of what it means, to why cosmopolitanism is so important. I talked a little bit already about the fragmentations. I mean, it kind of leads to a lot of the misunderstandings, I would say, that help that allow other people to divide us. And so, and yeah, I mean, I think with the idea of fluctuating norms among city states is also important as well. As things change with other states within the state, that this can eventually cause conflict, in the sense that the let's just say the inconsistent norms that exist, where there's a country that's unstable, they're unable to cooperate, and so there is this. Now we can say to ourselves, well, that country that's their problem, but that ends up being everyone's problem. That is where, kind of understanding that we're all interconnected, and not just operating in a vacuum, is essential. So, and I would say, and again, unequal exposure to misinformation and disinformation is another area where I would say that's something I would maybe want to come back to, the idea of digital literacy a little bit later. So, okay. So I want to go over the individual ethics and the ideal state, because gets into the idea of how the idea of the whole concept of cosmopolitanism has developed over the past since its inception. Now, well, just let me mention really quickly, Socrates was, the initial person that was thought to have said, I'm a citizen of the world. But there's the Cynics, and the Cynics are essentially, Stoicism was born, I would say, the forebearers of Stoicism. The idea that they reject all customs and political institutions, and we'll go over that in a little bit more detail, is in the sense that they looked at themselves as being citizens of the world and having their own personal ethical philosophy. And their ethical philosophy was very much focused just on virtue, and living a very minimal lifestyle, in the sense that they looked at as externals as being bad, whereas Stoics look at the externals as being indifferent. But they considered the idea that human laws and political institutions were essentially not necessarily, they were corruptible, and since these institutions are corruptible, that they weren't in alignment with nature, and therefore it's more important to maintain our own personal character, as opposed to actually following institutions that could actually be steering us the wrong way. And then we'll go a little bit, and this is how the traditional idea of just looking at it linearly, as to the early Stoa and the middle Stoa. And this early Stoa was much more of an individual ethic, but what we'll go through is how this individual ethic is actually related to the political ethic, the political structures and the governance structures. But it is very much more early on, focused on individual character, as we'll get into, where the idea of where Cicero or Seneca have their writings on cosmopolitanism, but these ideas are actually, while they are somewhat different, you can see that there's a relationship between all of them, and that's one area I'm going to kind of go into a little bit deeply once I get there, and maybe I'd be interested to hear everybody's comments about that, because part of this is also an exploration. Some of the things that I learned, I'd like to put on the table and just to get feedback and see what people's ideas are. So, okay, Cynics. So Diogenes Laertes was a cynic that was once asked, if he, where he hails from, and he would basically, his response was, "I'm a citizen of the world." And so, what he was doing is that he was basically not affiliating himself with any particular state or group. He was recognizing himself as a human being, and so this is what drove his ethics. And there was a focus on self-sufficiency. It was a radical form of individualism, and what self-sufficiency means that he was able to temper his desires to the point where he didn't need much to achieve what he perceived to be happy, his best self, or to flourish, so to speak. So, or to live a good life. And so, it's true happiness and freedom, he felt like, and it came from not from societal expectations, but it actually came from how we were able to govern ourselves. And I use that loosely because some of his practices were sometimes considered to be pretty obnoxious. But nonetheless, there is there's this idea that the political structures didn't dictate who he was or how he interacted with the world. It was more about just focusing on the idea of virtue itself. And as far as that, let me see, I just want to make sure I kind of covered this enough to the point where this idea of personal autonomy over social unity is also an important idea as well. It's that it was more about his ability to operate outside of political structures, and wasn't as concerned about how he interacted with others. So there's that aspect of it as well. So it's more or less it was a lifestyle. It was a philosophy of life, and how he could practice in the immediate, in the here and now, versus this idea of a political ideal. So I'll draw that. Okay, so then we move into Zeno. Zeno is the founder of Stoicism, and this is an interesting exploration I want to go on with everyone, because I'm going to deviate a little bit here. So Zeno is basically again the founder of Stoicism, and he had written what was called Zeno's Republic. And Zeno's Republic was seen as a kind of this elitist type of state, ideal state, almost, again, sometimes compared to Plato's Republic, in how there was a community of sages. And so that these sages were able to govern themselves by virtue and rationality. And it was focused on personal development. Now, it's interesting because the thing about Zeno was his idea of an ideal state differed from, say, whoops, sorry about that, differed from what Plato had considered. So basically, um, Zeno's ideal state didn't necessarily have this hierarchical structure at all. It was a community of sages where there was essentially no hierarchy at all. They governed themselves. There were no laws, no courts, no kind of open relationships. And where this, Plato was obviously much more hierarchical. He had the whole idea of this philosopher king. And so that there were soldiers who were the guardians, and then the producers, the farmers, and everybody had their role, and there was a specific size to them to it as well. And so that this is an interesting contrast, because this is something that I would like to explore a little bit with this when I think about Stoic cosmopolitanism and how it can actually be maybe realized at some point. So and I'm just thinking about this, and I haven't thought deeply about it, but I would like everybody's feedback when it comes to, Zeno has a boundary of sorts. His idea of the republic, again, this is like there was no need for laws. There was a equality, no private property, and it was living in accordance with nature. So it was kind of almost like like what Diogenes maybe would have envisioned, where there was this kind of no need for political structures, and you're operating at a level where everybody is pursuing what is good. But nonetheless, it is a boundary. It was a boundary that was actually set up to only for individuals that were sages. So then you have this other idea that that was again, Plato had his republic, and it was less around personal responsibility and more about what your role was. And again, the reason I find this to be an interesting exploration is because in both cases, there's a boundary that was set. And this boundary is, kind of, they've created an ideal state within the world. But I would say that in some ways, in exploring and just thinking about things in general, if Stoic cosmopolitanism is going to be maybe kind of recognized at some point, I looked at it from a perspective of building strong communities. That while there are communities that work together, that there are relationships with one another, and everybody has a role in the community, but it's part of a number of communities that kind of they see themselves as interconnected. So there's not a loss of the idea that that it's part of a global community, but locally, something you can control, you have that connection. And I think that that's a powerful concept to have, because I think that there are local cultures that have have their own history, and their own practices, and that needs to be respected. But it's about having local cultures understand that they're part of a greater community, part of the global community. And so there's that idea of a boundary that does exist. One of the things I also want to go into is that while Zeno's Republic may seem um, different than, say, what maybe Seneca or Cicero, as we'll see, had envisioned when their idea of cosmopolitanism, that it was probably more in line with the idea of nature, and that this natural emergence of virtue and how, to what degree even a political structure is needed, is something that we can also engage with and discuss, and to maybe bring this in a little bit to where we can have an understanding of its relevance. That maybe that the idea that even this was a debate amongst the founding fathers of the United States, as to when they were thinking about how, if you look at John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, John Adams felt like there actually needed to be a strong central government, and whereas Jefferson thought it was more about the idea of individual virtue, that was more important. So that changed their whole perspective on governmental structures. And you kind of can see that with Plato and Zeno here a bit. But now I've said that Zeno's ideas about his republic is that it's elitist, but it may not be as elitist as it first seems. And I'll get to that in a minute. So, but I do want to come back to this idea of communities in general to see if that's an idea of how cosmopolitanism can actually be realized going forward. So, okay. Now we're into the Middle Stoics. Now the Middle Stoics, and I kind of violated one of the cardinal rules by putting so many words on the on the slides themselves, but I did borrow from my friend's paper, and with that being the case, some of the quotes that he used, I think that were actually really captured what the Middle Stoics actually believed and thought. And I think that this is one of those key areas, is that when we're talking about the Middle Stoics, we're talking about what Seneca wrote. Let us take hold of the fact that there are two communities: the one which is great and truly common, embracing gods and men, and which we look neither to this corner nor to that, but measure the boundaries of our citizenship by the sun. The other, the one to which we have been assigned by accident or birth. So, or our birth, specifically. So, in this specific one, is that obviously Seneca is looking at it from as a idea of this political aspect of it, where he's recognizing that the boundaries that we draw are by birth. The countries that we're born into are not by our choice, but the idea that is you having a city that would actually embrace the idea that recognizes the inherent worth of each individual is the ideal way to kind of think about political structures. But he's looking at it from a boundary of a political structure, and that's kind of the shift here, versus actually seeing it as as just from the more individualistic perspective. And I think that that is one of those shifts that you'll see, but the question then becomes of how big of a shift it actually is. So and then it goes to the next quote. And this quote is actually directly from the paper that I was actually reading and going over in order to kind of cut to when I was covering this topic. That the first of these ideas that all human and gods are, by virtue of their shared rationality, fellow citizens of the cosmos conceived as a city ruled by divine reason. So from this particular passage, this is actually where we're kind of getting to some of the more humanistic approaches when it comes to cosmopolitanism, in the sense that rationality, it's our shared rationality that actually bonds us together, and that our fellow citizens of the cosmos, and this is Cicero, are conceived as a city ruled by divine reason. And so that this reason is what natural law is basically, is what bonds us together, not necessarily that it's not the city itself, but rather it's our reason. And so that where it doesn't, even though Cicero talks a lot about political structures and how governments are formed and how they interact, how they represent how we interact with each other, you can still see that that our shared rationality is what ultimately bonds us. But Cicero also offers a more practical thought that a benevolent empire governed in the best interest of its citizens might actually bring about a political state covering the entire world that could embody the humanist ideal. So on the flip side of this is that he takes the philosophical ideals and he integrates them with the political governance. So there is a more of a adherence to the political structures themselves. So this is basically looking to transcend nationalistic boundaries by essentially using political structures, but it still is with the idea that it's recognizing the commonalities that we have with each other. So just to recap is that while they both there's this individual ethic that goes to the more communal ethic, that there's a relationship between this individual behavior and the political structures themselves. But Cicero is actually more focused on this idea of the political structures. So, okay. So ultimately, all of this is saying that, and this is where it comes back to one of the fundamental ideas of Stoicism, is that Zeno's ideal society, while it seems isolationist and elitist, it can be looked in that what really bonds us together is reason. And that's the same thing that Cicero was saying as well. So even though there is this idea of the political structure and how that is impacting how we interact with each other, that it is still one and the same, is that they're both looking at something similar, which is that we're linked in by the idea of reason. Again, that's important, is because then you start to think about it Stoicism is about maintaining your own personal character, not necessarily maintaining yourself to externals. So the idea of the political structure obviously has an impact on how you live your life, but ultimately, your character and the way you see other people, that's up to you. And so it's not putting um, uh, the onus on the political structure to govern actually your, you know, your to determine what your character is. So, and the fact that Zeno and Cicero are kind of on the same page, it starts what I think to show, more importantly, is this relationship between the individual and the social. That's really where I wanted to kind of get that, hammer that home. There's a book that I recently read about the founding fathers of the United States, where I think that this is really comes out clearly, where your individual actions, a lot of the founding fathers of the United States felt like it was the people's ability to set aside their own personal interests for the betterment of the community, would determine whether or not that it would be they would be able to maintain their republic. So the individual and the social are one and the same, and I think that that's an important thing to recognize, because it's important to be able to understand ourselves. As I said a little bit earlier, one of the things is that with Stoicism is rooted in is this idea of nature, but it's our personal nature. But then understanding our personal nature and how we relate to everybody else is essential. And I think that that's, we can be our authentic selves, and that makes for something that are, much more healthy relationships. Now, that's not to say that we live outside those structures either, but it's also, you know, to the extent that we do live in those structures, that we actually understand ourselves and how we interact with the world, because that's what we control. So, okay, this is an area that I really kind of think that this is where I'm kind of going a little bit. It's still about cosmopolitanism, but it's really the practical sense about it. So there are modern components of cosmopolitanism that really focus on more of the moral obligations that we have. And so that what is it that it's not just my personal philosophy, but I would look at it as, what are the issues of the day? What is my role in society? How can I help, or what is it that what is my role, and how does it impact how other people in general, and how does that, being aware that how that fits into even the greater context of a nation itself, and ultimately the globe. So one of the things that the modern components of cosmopolitanism is that you have the ideas of safe migration for refugees. That is an important issue when it comes to cosmopolitanism. That you have equal access to quality education, and I want to come back to that because I think that that's essential. When I think about capacity building, I think about it people's ability to even have an understanding of themselves. And what do I mean by that? If you're an individual and you have to work 3 jobs in order just to make ends meet, well, then it makes it very difficult to really take time and to really understand yourself. So kind of understanding that, what it means to have access to a quality education, and what choices we actually have when we're talking about capacity. Like, what capacity are people actually, even what do they have access to? There's been a lot of discussions even about, I've had recently, about how people don't even necessarily have access to healthy food. And even if they do, they have to drive a significant amount of time in order to get there. So this is some of the modern components that they're actually worried more, they're concerned about some of the basic needs that need to be met in order for people to actually be able to become their ideal self. So part of that is, again, another aspect of it is promoting sustainable development in local communities, so that local communities are resilient. Then there's this idea of healthcare disparities, that people have good access to good healthcare, that these are essential items, and that not only that we don't that people have access to it, but it's that their health and well-being is directly related to our well-being, in the sense that not only it's how we are considerate of others, but if you think about it, if a person is in the hospital, unable to pay their bills and things along those lines, that has a tax on the whole entire system itself. So there are a lot of issues that emerge, and then there's this other idea that it's just unjust. So you create this discontent amongst the populace itself. So by focusing on some of these essential needs, that what you're doing is you're creating a relationship between you and other people. And so Cosmopolitan has us recognize not only thinking about ourselves, but also thinking about people that may be in any other part of the world. So, and this means also gender equality and a fair trade, and women's rights, as well as again, fair trade is directly related to wealth inequality. So the ability is basically empowering communities so that they have the healthcare and economic opportunities in order to sustain themselves, so that then they can take the initiative to actually have access to quality education and take advantage of that, by having some of the basic needs met. Now, this is just some of the ideas of the Sustainable Development Goals. And the Sustainable Development Goals are the idea that it's focused on it's kind of a framework that is basically looking to address global challenges like global warming and things along those lines, but also local challenges like, and I've underlined the ones that I feel like on a local sense, poverty, health and well-being, quality education is something that I want to talk about in a moment, as well as, again, reduced inequalities, economic inequalities, not just gender, and then climate, and basically strong institutions so far as that not necessarily hierarchical, but resilient institutions. And then there are partnerships, so that I would think like public-private partnerships in this particular instance. So when the reason I circle quality education is that this is something that I think is another area when it comes to the idea of how cosmopolitanism is even going to be possibly recognized as far as, or become possible, I would say. When I say quality education, I mean it in the sense that not some trade that you're going to do. I mean, that's obviously very important. But I'm talking about quality education so far as critical thinking, ethics, philosophy. A lot of these ideas and subjects that allow us to question and determine whether it's how to live a good life. But they also give us the ability to question, period. So when I see the idea of quality education, it's not just the trade somebody is doing. It's about how they interact with other people as well. And you only know that essentially if you're learning as to how to even have a philosophy of life that is consistent and coherent. So that if you have an ethical system and you have a way of making decisions in interacting with other people, the strictly intellectual education in and of itself is not enough. You can have a lot of really educated people doing a lot of negative things. So having people at least be aware and have an approach as to pursuing virtue, making better decisions, not only in your own personal self-interest, but also considering other people in the process, is essential in order building and to build the capacity that I would say that is necessary for a resilient community that is going to be self-sustaining. And if you have a lot of resilient, self-sustaining communities, that these self-sustaining communities will ultimately enable a cosmopolitan perspective on the world. So it starts to, the idea of building up small communities with people's ability to really pursue what is good, I think is one of those essential areas that needs to that's what quality is, in my opinion. And I think that when we're talking about the idea on a very practical sense, this is how some of these ideas that they are being implemented in reality. So ethics is really important. So the other idea is that building sustainable communities and resilient communities. So while we think of this as a global community, we keep this, the idea of having a global community, but it's local communities that I feel that will create the connections, and resilient local communities are essentially the way that something like cosmopolitanism will be able to actually thrive. Because I think that if you only look at it as from a uh, kind of top-down approach as to have some governing structure that's just going to say, this is the way the world is, and this is how it has to be. I think that that's probably going to fail. Whereas I think that building up local communities and doing what we can to build up local communities has a way of kind of almost like planting seeds that then grow, and that becomes self-sustaining and resilient. And I think that there are a lot of technologies now that are enabling that. And this comes back to my whole point as to why I went through the idea of what Plato had thought and how Zeno approached this idea of cosmopolitanism. It's that they had these small cities essentially that they were thinking about as their ideal states. So, well, if you just think of that as a small community and try and repeat that, across multiple cities or areas, that I feel like that's where something that you probably have a better chance of realizing something like Stoic Cosmopolitanism on a wider scale. And again, I think that building, again, these resilient communities that are self-sustaining, that means that there's job opportunities, that there are access to health, and these are some of the things that we just talked about a moment ago, and that we're optimizing the use of resources, in particular energy, and that we're reducing the costs of actually the cost of living, and that now these technologies are actually, we have scalable solutions that enable us to do that. So it's I think that this is we've come to a point in time where maybe building up smaller communities, that something like Stoic Cosmopolitanism is becoming a much more there's a much greater likelihood that a model that recognizes the idea of a global citizen, and a global citizenship, there's a higher degree of likelihood than there has been maybe in the past. But I still think it's important to think about it in terms of how the local community wants to live and feels like too, how cultures have developed and want to, in certain cases, continue to develop, as opposed to just coming down with this top-down structure. Having more of a framework like the SDG goals enables that. So this is a very practical application, I think, of Stoic Cosmopolitanism. So this also requires something like enhanced community engagement, cultural diversity and inclusion, as well as better services, increased safety, better emergency responses, because people's confidence in their government is part of the resilience of the community itself. And that would also involve ethical governance practices. There's one other aspect I want to bring up, is that if we remember what Zeno's Republic looked like as opposed to Plato's, Zeno's was, it wasn't hierarchical at all. It was by a community of sages that really kind of interacted with each other. And I would say that that's probably possible based on the ability for the community to be self-sustaining. Communities that, if you can't provide a lot of the basic needs, and if they aren't necessarily able to sustain themselves with for whatever reason, then I would say from that perspective, it becomes lends itself to a much more hierarchical approach. So I think that that's an interesting thing to consider, is that the ability for us to be able to be self-sustaining, which essentially is, if we think back to even what Zeno was talking about and Diogenes, they were always about being self-sufficient. There's a certain degree of freedom that comes along with that. So from that perspective, I think building these communities is an essential part of eliminating unneeded bureaucracies. Okay, so just really quickly, alignment, this is some of the key takeaways here, is that, so it's alignment with nature and reason. Zeno's ideal society kind of mirrors this, the sustainable city principles, I would say, specifically around resilience. When I think about that, resilience is the ability to be able to manage your emotions, some of those ideas that we talked about earlier, to have an idea of right measure, meaning resource management. I think this is as true for a local community as it is for an individual. So for focusing on internal virtue and self-sufficiency, we talked a little bit about that a moment ago. And so that is just having, responsible, sustainable practices. And then an expansion to broader cosmopolitanism, and having, supporting independent, sustainable cities. But those independent, sustainable cities don't lose perspective that they're part of, in the a global community, and then the inherent worth of individuals and community inclusion. As we talked about, the idea of being included in the community is essential, as far as understanding ourselves and the place in the community, but also the community not necessarily um, leaving anybody behind. So I think that that's where it comes to the idea of equitable cities. So these are things that I find that are actually feasible. I think technology is really, and I've heard this in the past. I've thought a lot about it in the sense that we've gone through different periods where a lot of people thought that technology was going to solve all our problems. But I would say this is a little bit unique, with the tools that we have now are surpassing a lot of human capability, and that is a unique. That's a little bit unique compared to other technological revolutions that we've actually um, encountered. So some of the other ideas is, maybe just some questions, but you can ask any question. Obviously, bring up any point that you wish to talk about. Do small, sustainable communities serve as the foundation for Stoic cosmopolitanism? How do modern technology advancements increase the likelihood of realizing Stoic cosmopolitanism? And what type of educational system or curriculum is necessary to sustain or promote cosmopolitanism? Those are just some questions I thought I would throw out there for people to consider.
To access other videos and podcasts in this series, go to the Philosophy Resources section of the Rational Realm website at www.rationalrealm.com.